So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about how if statements work in Excel. So if statements are useful if you want to determine if a value in a cell meets a certain criteria. And the basic requirements for an if statement in Excel is after the if expression to tell it this is the function you want to test, you want to give it a logical test. Now, typically, if you're doing numbers, these may involve inequalities. If you're doing text, they typically involve equalities. But basically, you want to see if the cell that you're testing has a particular value or satisfies a criteria. So for instance, if I want the cell A1 and I want to test whether or not this number is, let's say, greater than 30, and this is just a simple test to give you an example of how this works, then I type that A1 greater than 30. This is the test that it's going to satisfy. And then I put a comma and I specify what the output is going to be if this inequality, if this test is true. And so typically what we do is we put in a 1 if it's true and a 0 if it's false, although these are not the only possible options. We'll see some additional ones later. And then when I close the parentheses and hit enter, then 45 is indeed greater than 30. And so it specifies a 1 because the inequality is true. But now I can copy the formula all the way down the column, and it will test all the values in my list. And so what I can see here is some of them are greater than 30 and some of them are not greater than 30. And if I want, because I chose ones and zeros, I can actually very easily add up how many of these are in fact greater than 30 by using the sum function and highlighting all these cells. And so what that tells me is that 4 of the values are in fact greater than 30. Now I can go ahead and I can change this if statement. This is not the only option for the kind of logical test that I can use. I can put in a greater than or equal to 30. I can test just for equals 30, or I can do less than or equal to 30. And again, if I hit enter and I copy this down, then what it will do is it will recalculate, retest every value in the first column against this logical test, and then it will count 1 if true and 0 if false. And then my sum formula will automatically add up all the ones to tell me how many of my values satisfied that condition. Now, I can make this test much more complicated. There are functions that I can use for and or and things like that. Maybe I wanted to satisfy a very complicated condition. I can use those inside my logical test if I want, but for the moment, we're not going there. Now, this is an inequality that uses numbers. Now, what if I wanted to use words? So I have another example down here. Let's suppose that I wanted to determine, and again, so maybe I have a very, very long list of words, and I just want to count up how many of them are north. So I'm going to point at my cell, my first cell in the column. And then if I'm using a word, then what I need to specify is quotation marks around the name of the word. And then again, if I want to output ones and zeros, 1 typically is for true, 0 for false, then I can use my sum formula to count up. But I don't have to output ones and zeros. I could output true and false. True and false. Now, adding these up later may be more difficult, but I can specify whatever I want as my output. And so now, since that cell that I was testing for my initial formula does say north, the output is true. And if I drag it all the way down to the end of my list, then I can see that where it doesn't say north, I get false, and where it does say north, I get true. But as I said, this is treated as text now, so the sum formula isn't going to work on this if I wanted to know how many norths there were. But I could do this kind of formula for different terms. I could have a column that tested for north. I could have a column that tested for south. I could have a column that tested for east and a column that tested for west. And then what that would do is it would allow me to count up how many north, south, east, and west I had. Similar to what I did above, how many values were greater than 30. Now, essentially in a pivot table, that's what's going on behind the scenes. They're checking to see, they're figuring out what the possible values are. And then in the pivot table, they're checking to see when they do a count, how many of them match this particular value. And we're just doing this manually to illustrate how this if statement works. So let's change this to 0 and 1. And then we can actually do this for each of our columns. 1, 0, and we'll have north, south, east, and west. And I'll put in a if the cell equals south, 1, 0, and I'll type in if my cell equals east, 1, 0, and then equals if my cell equals west, 1, 0. And then I can copy these all the way down. And then sum them all up. So I have 6 north, and I have very evenly divided 6 south, 6 east, and 7 from the west.